you.
I ask that you get nice and close to that microphone. If you need to move it, you can just grab the base and move it close to you.
Thank you, Your Honor.
And when you are ready, please state your full name and spell your last name for the record.
Thank you, Your Honor. Gianni Pirelli, Pirelli.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ansel, your witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
Doctor, tell the court where you're employed, please.
I run my own practice, Pirelli Clinical and Forensic Psychology. It is based out of Verona, New Jersey, but I work throughout the state as well as I'm licensed in New York and Pennsylvania.
And how long have you had that practice?
This is my 14th year of my practice.
And tell the court what you do at that practice.
I myself conduct a full caseload of forensic evaluations in criminal and civil matters, Your Honor. And also, I oversee other doctors in the practice. At this point, there's one doctor, but we've had up to 6 at any given time.
And please tell the court your educational qualifications, please.
Yes. I completed my PhD from John Jay College of Criminal Justice, the Graduate Center, City University of New York, in 2010. And prior to that, I achieved a master's degree, although it was en route to that degree. It was through that same program. I had gone straight through from my bachelor's in psychology and criminal justice at Montclair State is where I completed my bachelor's.
And you're licensed to be a licensed psychologist in this state?
Yes, as well, again, as in New York and Pennsylvania.
How long have you had that license?
The New York license came first in 2011. New Jersey was 2012, and Pennsylvania was approximately 5 years after that.
And are you certified in any particular areas?
Yes, I'm one of just 6 people in New Jersey who is board certified in forensic psychology and 300 or so nationally.
And what clinical positions have you held prior to your present practice, please?
So certainly there was a significant amount of training before completing my doctorate for the degree. After that completion, I worked at New Jersey State Prison in Trenton. I worked then at Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital for over 2.5 years, and that was actually on an insanity equity unit, a forensic unit as they call it. And then I began to build my private practice at that point when I secured licensure. As I was building my private practice, I worked in essentially 2 other private agencies and practices as I was building mine.
Okay. And have you ever had any books published in the field of forensic psychology?
Yes, I have 3 books where I'm the lead on each of them, and that's through Oxford University Press. Ethical Practice of Forensic Psychology was the first one, and then 2 additional books on firearms and mental health related issues.
And have you ever taught in this field?
Yes, I have a significant teaching history. I taught over 40 courses at the undergraduate, graduate, and postdoctoral levels at Montclair State, John Jay College, and also Fairleigh Dickinson University. And after teaching, that was some time ago, I transitioned to continuing education seminars and then continuing legal education trainings. And that's what I've been doing more so the last 10 years. And at this point, frankly, it's more even what they refer to as CLEs, continuing legal education for attorneys. And in fact, for example, this year, for 3 different prosecutors' offices, provided mandatory training on these types of evaluations and issues, among others, in the criminal sector.
And how many forensic examinations would you say you've conducted in your career?
Approximately 1,500.
And have you ever been qualified as an expert in the field of forensic psychology?
Yes, I've testified 135 times or so. 110 of those approximately were court, the others were depositions. I've been qualified 100% of the time I've been presented as an expert.
And how many counties in Monmouth County, in New Jersey, have you testified?
I've testified in approximately half of the counties, I believe. I've worked in cases in that have been associated with every single county, and I've worked half of my practice is defense, half of my practice is for prosecutors. So I've worked also for half of the prosecutor offices in the state as well. But I've probably testified in about half of the counties.
Have you ever not been qualified as an expert?
No, I've always been qualified.
And how many times have you testified in an insanity case like this?
In these specific matters, probably about 20 or so of the 70 or so evaluations I've conducted. These are not the most common types of matters that come up, obviously, in the criminal arena, but this is one of my primary areas of expertise, so I think this is 20 or so times.
I think you mentioned earlier, but you testified for both the state and the defense?
Yes, definitely.
Please elaborate on that.
Absolutely. So I'm regularly hired by the prosecution throughout the state of New Jersey, the county offices that is, as well as private defense, and I also did over 10 years for the public defender's office as well. At this point in my practice and in recent years, it's been essentially 50-50 split, completely independent. In fact, right now, I believe I'm working for more prosecutors' offices at the moment on cases than defense.
Now, do you support the insanity defense every time that you're retained and testify?
No, definitely not.
Can you please elaborate on that?
Yes. So, again, being almost 15 years into practice, as you might imagine, I work with very reputable attorneys, so I'm also not getting a lot of random calls or cases. I don't work in a system. I work in a private practice, so I'm also not seeing everybody who kind of comes in and out of a system. And so I'm only getting really called, frankly, once a case has been vetted, or when a prosecutor's office certainly gets a report from a defense. That said, so that's kind of one checkpoint, in a sense. The attorneys who call me have probably already looked at it, at least, on the defense side. They're not going to just throw a case randomly at me. In that regard, they've worked with me for a long time at this point. But then there are additional checkpoints to that. For example, I evaluate someone, if I'm evaluating them for the defense, certainly if I cannot support the defense, very likely they're not going to be asking me for a report in any way. And so, again, by the time I were to testify in a case, at least for the defense, it would have gone through a number of checkpoints. Of course, with the prosecution, it could be very different. But I will say, for me, because I am completely independent, it makes no difference to me in the sense that there have certainly been times where I've not supported the defense when hired by the defense, and there's also been times I've been hired by the prosecution where I thought the defense was viable.
Great. Your Honor, at this point in time, I'd offer Dr. Gianni Pirelli as an expert in forensic psychology.
And
No objection, Judge.
based on the doctor's education, training, and experience, the court admits him as an expert in that field.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, Your Honor. So, Dr. Pirelli, let's talk about this particular case. You were retained by the defense in this case, and what was the purpose of your retention in this case?
I was retained by your office to determine if there was a potential mental health defense, particularly related to our New Jersey insanity statute.
And when you are engaged in that type of evaluation, do you have a protocol that you follow for these
Yes.
examinations? Can you please explain to the court what that consists of?
Yes. I engage in only best practices, and so in line with best practices in my field, as well as this particular area of practice, I conduct record reviews, clinical forensic interviewing with the examinee or the defendant in this matter, in addition to what's referred to as collateral interviewing when possible, which would be speaking with family members, friends, doctors, other providers, whoever may be relevant in a particular case. And at times, not usually in these types of cases, psychological testing can be called for. Because these are retrospective evaluations, someone's mental state at the time of an offense, testing has significant limitations because it can only really help with the first part of the question at hand, which is, does the person have a mental disease or defect, as what the law would call it, but a severe mental illness, for example. It can help, testing can help with that, but it's, again, when you're testing someone, it's at this present time. We can't go in a time machine, so beyond that, it's not particularly helpful. And when we have a situation where we have someone like Mr. Hertgen who has an extensive mental health history that's been well documented across many sources, many providers over the years, frankly, I can usually feel comfortable to move to step 2, which is, there probably is some sort of condition at hand. Now, does it apply to the statute? So testing is not very common in these matters.
So the protocol that you just spoke about, you followed that protocol in this particular case?
Yes, in this particular case, there was significant data across all those other areas. I interviewed Mr. Hertgen for 15 hours across 5 sessions. Yes, I'm sorry, Matthew. I can refer to him however you prefer. Would you prefer me?
No, I just want, there's other Hertgens you're going to speak
for sure.
about. So.
I understand.
So let's talk about Matthew Hertgen.
Would you like me to say Matthew when I? What's your preference?
Your counsel's conducting the exam.
Okay. Matthew?
Hertgen.
Okay, thank you. So with Matthew, 15 hours across 5 sessions. With his parents, 10 hours across 3 phone sessions. And I also reviewed over 1,000 pages of quote-unquote paper documents, as well as approximately 11 hours of audio and video files.
And did these written documents consist of prior medical records?
Yes, significant amount.
And did they also consist of videos of interviews of Matthew, his brother, and his father?
Yes, so that part was what I would refer to as the discovery part of the record review. And in that part, in addition to police reports and what have you, and some of the other reports that were mentioned earlier by Mr. McCann, there were also, videos with interactions with Matthew, as well as a video of law enforcement speaking to his brother and then separately with his father.
And you had a chance to review the stipulated facts that have been entered as a joint exhibit in this case, have you not?
Yes, since obviously that was after my report,
Right.
But yes, I have.
But you would agree that the stipulated facts are accurate as they relate to what you reviewed in this case?
Yes, they're consistent with everything I've seen.
Let's talk about the video of Matthew Hertgen that you reviewed at headquarters. Anything of note that you can tell the court with reference to that particular video?
Sure. Is it okay if I reference my report?
Certainly.
Yeah. I do recall, certainly off the top of my head, regardless, that with Matthew, he was pretty seemingly emotionless. Now, I should also say that there were a couple opportunities to see videos of him and audio from the discovery. And so he did sit down with law enforcement. He did not provide a formal statement per se, but at the scene when he was questioned and so forth. So I would just say across all sources that I was able to view as part of the discovery, he presented as very, the jargony term would be flat in his affect, meaning emotionless, pretty monotone, and so forth. And that becomes relevant because it's a hallmark symptom of the condition I firmly believe he has and he's been diagnosed with over the years. And again, that will continue to be relevant as I start to put other data points together.
Were you able to review any videos of interviews of his brother David Jr.?
Yes.
And anything of note that you can talk about with reference to your review of those videos?
The interview with his brother was very important as well because, if I may preface it, because I also am not there when something has happened and it's a question of someone's mental state at the time, these videos become oftentimes very important because they are at the time of what happened. So it's very helpful to me, especially when it's a video, not just paper. And so I say that because there's 2 main aspects to that video with his brother that are particularly important for my purposes. And one is that he clearly substantiates an extensive mental health history that his brother has. He goes in some detail to explain it, that it's been going on for a number of years. To that point, he explained the types of symptoms and what I would be referring to as psychotic symptoms in particular today, such as paranoia and delusions and hallucinations, which I'm sure I'll explain further. But his brother not only was able to lay all that out and explain that that history has been in place for a number of years to that point, and that he had significant treatment efforts, that significant treatment efforts had been made over the years to that point, but also central to the question at hand, he was also with him on the date in question. And that becomes, of course, the second part of the question, as I indicated earlier, which is not only does someone have maybe a severe mental illness, which is a prerequisite, if you will, it's necessary, but it's not necessarily the case that everybody with a severe mental illness would qualify for the defense. Now, of course, it's your Honor's decision anyhow, but I would just say that from an expert standpoint, that's the case. And his brother, therefore, who was with him the entire day, also was able to explain in some detail his mental state that day. And his mental state that day, per his brother's reports, was extremely impaired. He was very psychotic. Again, it was consistent with what he had previously experienced, but his brother explained that it was, this is my paraphrase, Your Honor, but particularly bad that day. He, for instance, said, and I'm paraphrasing again, but it wasn't my brother who I was speaking to, essentially, and he was very concerned about him.
Was there a time where David spoke about a time where he was living in New York City with Matthew?
Yes, so as I think will become clear as I move forward today, Matthew's symptoms, his psychotic symptoms, did start a number of years earlier. And in the earlier part of the illness, I guess I can say, somewhere in the region of 2022, 2021, 22, and 2023 for sure, there was significant paranoia, and he explained that, those types of concerns in New York City when he had been living there with him and what he had observed there.
And was there a time where you reviewed a video of Matthew's father, David Sr., the day of this happened?
Yes, so that was also part of the discovery, and that was a separate video, and that was, yes, on this date.
Anything of note that you found when reviewing that video as it relates to your opinion here this morning?
Similarly, his father substantiated that there was a significant mental health history. He, indicated that it dated back about 5 years, and that, again, is consistent with other data that I've seen. I do, if I may, also would like to point out that as an expert, my opinions can only be based on data, and they can only be as strong as the data. And so I'm always looking to see, of course, if the data is converging, and the more it converges, not only does my opinion form, but the stronger my opinion. I say that because it's all pointing in the same direction, and it's all consistent, meaning somewhere in the region of 5 years earlier, 2020, 2021, the family starts to recognize significant concerns. Again, Manhattan or New York City, I believe, as you called it, came up in the interview with his father. There was concerns. He was struggling with work. Another major theme, I think you'll hear me say today, is, as his father described it as well, and his brother also, there was a lot of visions, is the word that'll be used. And these visions are, in my world, a different way of referring to delusions and hallucinations. And again, I'll explain that in greater depth, I'm sure, when I get to my interviewing with him. But it's consistent with the brother's report and his father's report as well. And also his father indicated that he was spending a lot of time in his room, laying in the dark, and what have you. So this is, from a clinical standpoint, what we would refer to as functional impairments, and that becomes very important as well, because it's not only that someone is having mental health related symptoms, but it's impairing their functioning. And that's another hallmark of certain severe mental illnesses as well. And that becomes relevant in terms of a diagnosis as well, because some diagnoses impair you more than others. And so the word schizophrenia does arise. I believe his brother mentioned it, in fact, but that, again, will be the term, the diagnosis that comes up over and over as we move forward. His father also did point out to that, in that vein, that he had been prescribed antipsychotic medication. He had been receiving treatment, but again, he was continuing to struggle with severe symptoms, psychotic symptoms, visions. And I'll also point out that the nature of the visions and what have you, again, becomes consistent with the other records that I reviewed, as well as my interviewing with Matthew.
Thank you. As part of your review, did you also come to find that Matthew kept written journals?
Yes. He did. Yes, I mean, that's the short answer.
Did you have the opportunity to review them?
Yes.
And of anything of note that would be important to your ultimate opinion here this morning?
Sure. The journals I reviewed, and it's a little unclear how many journals there might have been, because Matthew was very psychotic for quite some time, frankly, including the time I saw him. And he was also on an extensive road trip in 2023, et cetera. So he was producing a tremendous amount of content. But I'm fairly confident that it's all pointing in the same direction in terms of the content, because, again, every other data source really is. And so the journals, and I'm using quotes, journals, they were, I believe, frankly, notes that he was taking for himself, somewhere, on his phone and what have you. But I would say the kind of overarching point there is that they were the same types of content that I'm seeing reported from the family and reported from him as I speak with him. And that content is essentially a lot of religious delusions and beliefs, and as well as other types of imagery, if you will, volcanoes, eruptions, fires, demons, and the list goes on.
And how are these journals relevant to your ultimate conclusion as to his mental state?
So again, I don't kind of take one piece of information and run with it. So if all we had was journals, I don't know what my opinion would ultimately be, but it starts to continue to move in that same direction. And as I'm going through my hypothesis testing process of my evaluation, again, it starts to all point in the same direction. And so it becomes very relevant because, again, now we're looking at independent data sources that are all essentially saying the same thing, right? And so to this point, at least our discussion to this point has been not only his journaling, if you will, but again, his reports from his family members. And I continue to move in that direction, of course, when I interview him, and then also at length, and then also his family again.
So it's safe to say that Matthew does have a documented history of mental health issues?
Yes, and that gets to my review of the medical mental health records. It's very well documented.
And he's sought treatment for this in the past?
Yes, he's. So again, the short answer is yes, but I can explain if you like.
And you were provided with the records of these attempts at treatment?
Yes.
Can you go over what's the earliest records that you had of treatment that Matthew undertook for this?
The earliest record that I have is 2021.
Where was that from?
From Princeton House Behavioral Health, although I do believe he started treatment at some level in 2020 with a Dr. Mizell. I note that because I only had the Dr. Mizell's records of 2023, but based on all the information I have across sources, he started some initial treatment for what was thought to be maybe ADHD or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder at that initial time with Dr. Mizell. However, his symptoms quickly became apparently very severe, and so that led to Princeton House Behavioral Health in 2021.
And was he there inpatient or on outpatient? If you know?
He was admitted into the outpatient program at that time.
And was he prescribed any medication at that time?
Yes, sorry, I'm just referencing my report also. Yeah, so again, there was some indication that he had been prescribed Adderall, around that time, not necessarily by that program, but again, it was related to that ADHD diagnosis. But in the program per se, he was prescribed Ativan and Abilify, which are antipsychotic medications.
You're familiar with both of those medications?
Yes, I'm not a prescribing psychiatrist, but I've been in the field at some level for 25 years, so I'm very familiar with the medications.
And were you able to review what the symptoms that Matthew exhibited at that time at Princeton?
Yes, so again, in Princeton House Behavioral Health, what's reported at that point is, I think I used the jargony term before as well, paranoia. And so specifically what that looked like, per the records, was that he believed others were watching him, spying on him, listening to him, photographing him with their cell phones, and what have you. He was also kind of reportedly screaming at people in Penn Station, and he had indicated that that last couple of year period was very difficult for him. He had been having irritability and distractibility and racing thoughts, and a lot of what looked like potentially depression, that's my word, but in terms of mood symptoms, crying spells, and decreased motivation and so forth. So he was actually, not surprisingly, in retrospect, he was actually diagnosed with bipolar 1 disorder at that point. There was also a question of a trauma disorder and some substance use issues that were an issue prior, but he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And again, that kind of makes sense at that time, because even though he had psychotic symptoms, he also was presenting with a lot of these mood symptoms and behaviors and so forth. So that was happening at that time. And it's important, I think, to point out, just in terms of the trajectory of his illness, whereas, again, there was some concern about, does he have ADHD or not, because he's feeling distracted and what have you, but then quickly it becomes something more. Maybe it's a mood disorder, maybe there's a mood disorder with psychotic symptoms, but again, he's kind of at that point in the community, acting in a certain way. He's still functioning at some level, but struggling, but the condition worsens, and then ultimately it takes another transition, I would say, from my standpoint, in around 2023, but it never remits. It continues to follow, unfortunately, a gradual, I would say, decline, although that's with the benefit of retrospect.
He stopped going there at some point in time?
Yes, so ultimately, he was not wanting to take his medications. He really didn't feel like he needed them, and he did stop going.
Did he seek treatment after that at another facility?
Yes, so again, there was some indication, although I didn't have those records, there was some indication that he continued to see. He may have continued to see Dr. Mizell or not around that period, but the next significant treatment intervention, if you will, is Palo Alto Medical Facility, which is in 2023.
And that's in California?
That is. And that was during the course of, you'll hear this term today, I think, too, but a road trip that he was taking by himself throughout the country. And but yes, so Palo Alto becomes another significant checkpoint, if you will.
And do you know how long he was at Sutter Health in Palo Alto?
Sorry, I didn't have that off the top of my head. He was in there, I know the records began in June of 2023, and I do have an entry as late as the end of July. So it was at least a month or so. I'm sorry, I don't have the exact off the top of my head.
And what did you learn from your review of the records of his stay at Palo Alto?
So again, at that point, per the records, and Matthew helped me kind of fill in all the gaps, if you will, but per the records, the symptoms take a significant change at that point. At that point, he's reporting a history of significant headaches and burning in his face and throughout his head, which he said was happening for a few years at least. What's very important to point out is that the records that follow from 2021 on all indicate continued sobriety. And also the family corroborated that, and Matthew also corroborated that. That's very important, again, from a diagnostic standpoint, because one of the first things you have to do is rule out any substance use. Is someone on maybe PCP or what have you? But he was completely sober to that point, per all records and per all information, and he had been since at least 2021. But anyhow, maybe there was a minor alcohol use briefly, but then that also stopped. But the main issue was he was having psychotic symptoms. At that point, visual hallucinations of ghosts. I should also say, just as a matter of jargon, so hallucinations are when you have symptoms that are in any area of your senses. So it could be auditory is one of the more common ones, meaning people hear voices, but it could be visual, it could be gustatory, olfactory, tactile, what have you. But Matthew's were primarily visual, and they continue to be. And also delusions. So delusions, in contrast, are beliefs, of course, bizarre beliefs and false beliefs. And so thinking that he was God walking around New York City and what have you. And the paranoia and what have you also continued. What becomes particularly relevant from those records as well is that he then is diagnosed with schizophrenia. And I believe from that point forward, every professional, I probably shouldn't use an absolute, but essentially every professional that I recall seeing, including myself, and anyone else had diagnosed schizophrenia.
Now, you mentioned Dr. Mizell. Do you have Dr. Mizell's full name?
Sorry, 1 second, please. I don't have the doctor's full name. Well, maybe I do.
Would it refresh your record? Dr. Jason Mizell?
Okay, that sounds
Where
fine.
was his office located?
Sorry, just I don't actually have that.
But you realize that there was treatment along the way, Matt and Dr. Mizell interspersed throughout these?
Yes, so again, there was indication that Dr. Mizell had worked with him as early as 2020 into 2021, but definitely the records I had were from 2023, and at that point you're seeing the treatment specifically for, again, well, the diagnosis, at least initially, was major depressive disorder with psychotic symptoms, generalized anxiety disorder. But what's important is not so much the labels, but the symptoms that were reported and outlined by the doctor. So that Matthew was seeing shadows, for example. He was feeling overwhelmed and again, continued to have a worsening of psychotic symptoms, although wanted to come off the medication because he didn't feel it was helpful to him. He was prescribed antipsychotic, Risperdal at that point.
And he was diagnosed by Dr. Mizell as well?
He was diagnosed by that provider with major depressive disorder, recurrent with psychotic features, and generalized anxiety disorder. What I can say is, again, primarily from 2023 on, schizophrenia was diagnosed, but Dr. Mizell had been treating him prior as well. So earlier on, it was thought to be more of a mood disorder with psychotic features. But as I indicated in my conclusion, I believe it really doesn't necessarily matter. Everybody's basically just trying to communicate the same things, that there was a lot of mood concerns, but the psychosis was paramount.
There came a point in time in October of 2023 where you went to a facility known as Hampton Behavioral Health Center,
Yes, sir.
and were you able to review records from his stay there?
Yes, I did.
And what did you learn from those records?
So at that point, again, psychosis comes up, continued psychosis. He was reported to be paranoid. You'll see the word even manic. Again, that really corresponds more to bipolar disorder a lot of times, but they're seeing behaviors that look like grandiosity. In other words, I think I'm God, what have you. But again, it's a delusion either way. He was anxious and bizarre, as they described it. He was struggling for a few years, and there was also some concerns about suicidal ideation at that point as well.
And were they prescribing medication at Hampton?
Yes, so he was also prescribed antipsychotic medication, Haldol, at that point.
There came a point in time where after Hampton, he began treatment with Charlie Health.
Yes. And
What exactly is Charlie Health?
Charlie Health was, was a place he was admitted in 2023, and his admission was for psychosis as well. He was treated with antipsychotic medications once again. And so that is also consistent. Regardless of some of the variations in the labels that were used, antipsychotic medication was a mainstay for through and through to that point across facilities.
And you were presented with records of his treatment at Charlie Health?
Yes, and those records, again, were also very detailed in describing similar types of psychotic symptoms. I can explain them if you'd like.
If you, just generally speaking, what did you learn from a review of those records while at Charlie Health?
So one of the things that comes out, not only the continued kind of hallucinations and delusions, but solitude and what can seem like depression, which again, is not surprising that some of the earlier diagnoses were major depressive with psychotic features or bipolar with psychotic features because, again, I do have the benefit of retrospect. I'm not knocking those earlier providers, but what we certainly know is that a condition like schizophrenia has what's referred to as positive symptoms as well as negative symptoms. And so the positive symptoms are those hallucinations and delusions. But there's also the other side of it, which are referred to as negative symptoms, which can look more like depression. And that's where you're seeing the emotionless presentation, what we refer to as flat affect, or the way in which someone's presenting. And also, again, what is going to look more like depression, isolation, and so forth. And that becomes a very big theme, in fact, particularly in my interviews with Matthew, in terms of really extended isolation. And that was also corroborated. His brother certainly mentioned that to law enforcement as well, that he had lost his friends by that point for quite some time, and he had basically become completely isolated for a number of years, or for a couple of years, I should say, to that point, and a number of years to the point I saw him. Nevertheless, they believed he had what are referred to as somatic delusions, physical. He felt like he was being burned, as he put it, burned alive every second. He was greatly impacted on the daily basis, his visual hallucinations, and all of these areas, Your Honor, basically are described as 5 out of 5 pain, 10 out of 10 pain, and what have you. So it was very intense symptoms as well. It wasn't just passing. But again, more of the same in terms of the other symptoms as well, paranoia and grandiosity and the like. And the other theme that becomes really prominent around that time, again, we're talking about in 2023 in particular, is the concept of his souls, plural, and his two souls. And again, that becomes very relevant, especially for my purposes, because that's central to the incident in question that we're here for, the tragedy that we're here for, pertains in large part to his souls. And he certainly explained to me in depth kind of the origination of that. Didn't necessarily originate in 2023, but the point remains that independent records by other providers are reflecting that. And again, this is years prior to this tragedy.
So now let's go to a point in time where after he was arrested, he was at the Mercer County Jail.
Yes, I also did review records from multiple facilities or entities after his arrest, which was, as you indicated, Mercer County Jail, in addition to Klein and Capital Health.
So let's go to a period of time from February 23rd to March 13th. You reviewed records from Mercer County Jail as they relate to his mental health condition at that time?
Yes.
And what did you learn from those records?
So if I may slightly preface it by saying, even though it's after the offense, and I certainly said that this is a statute that is retrospective, it's very important that the conceptualization makes sense in order for me to feel confident in my opinion. In other words, if I were to say someone has schizophrenia, but then the records don't flow after that in terms of the symptomatology, well, then I should be questioning my position. Even though it might be just the first part of the prerequisite part of the statute, if you will, it's still important that there's consistency. Otherwise, I have to go back and figure out what might be going on. And so I say that because the records continue in the same fashion, you know. And so, although certainly quite sad for Matthew in terms of his mental health and the family and so forth, from my standpoint, it's very important, and it's a very, I don't want to say it's a good thing, but it's important, I'll just say, because it adds more confidence to the fact that this is definitely the condition he was having. And not only were multiple professionals seeing it for years prior and documenting it, and his family was certainly observing it, but even after the incident, it continues to be diagnosed. So excuse the preface, but you asked me what they saw. Well, again, similarly, these divine or prophetic divine visions, as it was quoted, a lot of religious content, heaven, hell, apocalyptic types of content, demons and witches and spirits and so forth. And so, though at that point, he was also believing that he was Jesus and there was going to be an apocalypse. So again, this is even like right at the time of the incident, right after the incident. And that's not necessarily something he still thought by the time I saw him. I mean, he was not stable when I saw him either, but he was having that particular delusion at that time. And again, that does correspond directly to what happened in this case.
While he was at the jail, there was a suicide attempt. Is that accurate?
Yes, and so there was. Do you want me to speak to that briefly?
You reviewed records as it related to that?
Yes. So
and how was that important to your ultimate conclusion?
So again, kind of concepts related to his souls and Jesus and religious content and what have you come up. The suicide attempt, as I ultimately learned, it was a little unclear, obviously, at the time, but in the records, but corresponded to him thinking that maybe he was the Antichrist or maybe he was the Christ. Like, he was confused, and he needed to, in order to kind of save the world, if you will, or prevent the apocalypse, or he's having these types of thoughts that he would need to end his own life. And so he did make a suicide attempt.
At some point in time, he was transferred to Klein in March of 2025?
Yes, so briefly, I will note that he was initially treated at Capital Health in relation to that attempt. If I may just speak to that for one moment. So he, again, was seeing visions, death, dying, religious preoccupations, and they also noted he was actively psychotic, believing he was Jesus. So I just point that out to say that that was the transition. And again, yet another independent entity that is seeing this. He is brought to Klein, I believe, in March 13th, 2025, from the jail.
And you were able to review records of his stay? He stayed there until July 9th, 2025?
Yes.
And what did you learn from the review of the records as to his stay in Klein?
Again, they indicated that he was psychotic, that he was experiencing visual hallucinations, that he was religiously preoccupied, and he didn't want to take medication. And essentially, and I'm not trying to be dismissive, but it was just continued to be a lot of the same content and really just consistent with everything I've spoken about thus far in terms of the psychosis, the symptoms. And he also did, certainly speak about what happened and his brother and feeling extremely sad for about what happened and for his family, for his brother, and what have you.
So after you reviewed all these records, you then turned to an interview of Matthew.
Yes.
And how long did that take?
So again, I saw him 5 times for a total of approximately 15 hours. They were all in person. The first 3 sessions were at Klein Forensic Center. The last 2 were at the Mercer County Jail.
And tell the court what you learned as a result of these interviews.
So as you can imagine, it's a lot of hours. I certainly learned a lot. I can summarize
if you would, please.
If that's helpful. I don't say this lightly, and I certainly don't want to make Matthew or his family feel bad, but I think it's important for me to say that when I saw him, and based on my record review, he is one of the most severe mental illnesses that I've seen. In terms of someone who could still hold a conversation, for example, obviously there's people who are completely incapacitated that can't even interact. But I say that not on a whim, but I say that because Matthew is constantly psychotic. He indicates, just even anytime he closes his eyes, he's seeing tremendous visions, and they're all in line with the records and the reports from the family and what have you that we already went through. And so that's extremely uncommon. Well, first of all, this type of illness of schizophrenia is extremely uncommon to begin with. But for someone to be that severely ill and also still be able to have a conversation of sorts is extremely uncommon. That becomes important also because, as the family would explain, he was able to have certain conversations. He could talk about the baseball game or something like that, in some way. Okay? And not that he was fine, but and so it was a little unclear, the severity. Matthew's able to tolerate tremendous amount of pain, physical and psychological pain. And that's me saying that because it's very clear from the records and just meeting with him how much significant pain he's in. So, to even be engaging with me that long. That becomes also relevant because Matthew is still, and I say still, of course I haven't seen him since September. It was the last time I saw him, 2025. But obviously to that point, and I haven't learned of anything different, but he's still questioning what's happening. He's still trying to understand what all these thoughts are, beliefs are. He's willing to call it psychosis kind of for our benefit to have the conversation, and he wants to be able to try to get help and some relief, but he believes that the spirit that overtook him in 2021 is basically too powerful for any medications or mental health treatment that would come about. If I may say, I'll get back to his mental health in a moment, but in terms of his history, it was also consistent with what I learned from the family as well. In other words, he had a good upbringing. He was never violent. He was never someone who was dangerous or ever a risk or acted out. His brother, I didn't interview his brother, but his brother indicated to law enforcement that, essentially never in a million years would he have thought that Matthew would have harmed anybody or anything. And so Matthew was very active, young man, along with, his siblings and his family. And I just kind of, in a nutshell, can say that, sparing all the details about his early history, there were no significant concerns at earlier points in his life. He did develop some substance use challenges, and he did have an episode in or around 2014, which seems to be a really bad reaction to substances he was using at the time, although Matthew's perception of it is a little unclear. He recognizes that it was connected to substances, but he still believes that was kind of when there was a soul loss. And once again, that becomes a prominent theme that comes up in the years later. But that's 2014. It's not until 2021 where his mental health symptoms per se, as we've already gone over, really escalated.
You mentioned that there was a time in 2021 where a spirit overtook him. Did he talk about that particular incident with you involving the egg?
Yes, in 2021, excuse me. So Matthew indicates that in 2021, it's when it all started, quote unquote, and this is when a spirit kind of came to him and kind of overtook him in a sense. And he goes into a lot of detail with me about the spirit and kind of his thoughts on what it may be and what it may not be. But the point is, it's never left him, he believes. It's always there. It's always there even visually for him at some level, more or less. If he closes his eyes, it's more... It's easier for him to see certain things, but kind of it's always with him, this purple spirit and what have you. And again, even as I sat with him, that was something that was going on for him. And that's all consistent with the records, as I mentioned. So that's where you see 2021 being this checkpoint. He did have an episode when he was on vacation with friends, which may have predated that by a few months, where he was out of the country with friends, and he had a psychotic episode where he felt there were that the kind of place he was staying in was haunted and what have you. But that was some months prior to this spirit incident, which again overtook him.
So you'd spoken a couple of times about this road trip that he took in 2023. You spoke to Matthew about that at length?
Yes.
And why was that significant as part of your diagnosis?
So, as was indicated, in 2020, he started to get some initial help for what was believed to be maybe ADHD or some issues with distractibility and what have you, which again we kind of now know was the precursor to a much more severe issue. In 2020, from 21 to 23, as we already indicated also, he started to try to get some additional help. He was still having symptoms, as I noted. At that point, though, in the earlier stages, it was a lot more of, I don't want to say typical, but typical for this condition of FBI might be after him, people are watching him. It was kind of what I would see more commonly as paranoia in the community. 2023, as I see it, from my standpoint, is a bit of a turning point because he starts to look at his condition differently, essentially. The whole time, he's a very intellectual person, so he was always trying to figure out what was going on. He was willing to accept help, but as I said, it wasn't that he was being dismissive of medication or help. It's just he believed this was way too powerful. This was above and beyond what anyone could help him with. He believed it was at a spiritual level, essentially, that medication and what have you wouldn't necessarily help him with. He certainly hoped, even when I saw him, that it might help with the burning sensations or the headaches and a lot of those symptoms. But again, the overarching concern he's always had is that it's just overtaken him and it's a much bigger issue. And so in 2023, by 2023, he had gone through so much of this soul searching, in fact, as he referred to it, and reading, tremendous amount of reading. That becomes very relevant. He was reading a lot of books. He was reading a lot of philosophy. He was reading the Bible. There's a few books that become particularly relevant as we move on. But he decides that he's still trying to work, and his family's still trying to certainly help him, but he decides that he's going to continue to try to figure out what's happening. So that's where this idea of a road trip comes up. And he essentially, on his own, even though he was still trying to work, it's coming off of the pandemic, or it's still in the heart of the pandemic when, of course, he had his symptoms, but so he was doing some virtual work, this and that. But at that point, it's 2023, he's still able to do some virtual work. If we want to call it that, he was struggling significantly. He wound up on his own renting many Airbnbs throughout the country, and essentially started from this area and made his way ultimately to Palo Alto, and then back. But so this road trip becomes important because, again, he's doing a lot of journaling, and though the journaling also changes, he believes that at that point he can actually start to communicate with his souls. In other words, they're communicating through his words, through his journaling. So it's not necessarily him journaling per se, like, oh, this is what dear journal, this is what I think today or something, but more so that the messages from his souls were coming through him. And it, from my standpoint, becomes an important checkpoint in his illness as well, because he almost gets some relief. He doesn't from a clinical standpoint at all. I mean, he's getting worse, frankly. But in his mind, something changes. And I'll use a little jargon, but I'll explain it. So it becomes egosyntonic, which means it's no longer really bothering him as much anymore, what's happening to him. Of course, the physical symptoms are, but he's starting to come to realizations in his mind that, okay, now I'm figuring out what these souls are. Now I'm figuring out why this might be happening. Now I'm able to communicate and understand, what my souls are and all this type of stuff. And again, this starts to correspond with what he's reading. He's reading Carl Jung's Red Book. He's reading Nietzsche's. He's reading the Bible and what have you. So he's really kind of now at this point not necessarily focused on, okay, people are filming me in the streets or the FBI or there's paranoia necessarily. He's now more focused on, okay, almost philosophically, his identity, his souls, and what have you. So that's what he's doing throughout the country. And he's kind of by day trying to work a little bit, but then going on runs and going on, kind of mountains and Joshua Tree and, the kind of very almost like symbolic philosophical journey.
Okay. When you spoke to Matthew, he told you that he had visions. That became a pretty important part of your interview. Can you please go into more detail as to what you meant by that?
The visions are critically important for the question at hand because, unfortunately, a major vision, as I'll refer to it, as he refers to it, was why this happened. This tragedy happened. But I'll summarize like this. So Matthew has had minor visions, and again, I'm using that term because this is a term he uses, minor visions dating back to approximately 2021. In other words, in the last few years, prior to this incident, essentially at all times, 24/7, 365, he was experiencing, seeing different things and hearing different things to some extent and having different delusional thoughts and what have you. So that was always the case. And as I said, even when I sat with him and he explained that he continued to have this, I said, well, so if you kind of close your eyes right now, explain to me what you see. And he was able in significant detail to explain, volcanoes and eruptions and fire and again, consistent with what his family reported he was reporting in the years prior. So those minor visions, and of course, again, I don't call them minor in terms of clinical. It's still extremely severe. Sorry?
Those were his words.
Those are his words because he's differentiating from minor and major. Again, I'm not trying to minimize it's severe psychosis regardless. But what he's distinguishing is that there are these major vision episodes, if you will, that he's had 5 to 7 of. So, in other words, in the backdrop, he was constantly dealing with psychosis through and through, unremitting, since his symptoms started, let's call it 2021. From 2021 to the time I saw him, he had 5 to 7 major visions. I won't go through each one, but I can give you a couple examples.
Well, he was able to describe each of these visions to you?
Yes, he was.
Hey, can you just summarize them for the board, please?
Yes, sorry, I just wanted to find a reference point if you don't mind.
Take your time.
Yep, okay. Thank you. The first major vision happens in June of 2022. He was alone in his apartment in New York City. I'll summarize. A storming is going on outside. A cloud comes up to his window. God, as a spirit, as an alien creature, and so forth, comes. A spaceship kisses him, and this and that. And so he continues to have major visions or symptoms from that point forward. But again, those are not on a daily basis. In other words, he has another one in summer of 2022. They start to continue to have this apocalyptic kind of themes of, river of life and mud and, creatures and what have you. Different realms and the like. Then in summer of 2023, he was in an Airbnb during the course of his road trip in Colorado Springs. Again, in his bed alone. There's a castle and, kind of dungeons and different experiences like that. So those are the types of major visions or episodes he was having, but they were more spread out. They were not the daily experiences for him. Unfortunately, he also had, incidentally, a major episode after the incident in question as well in the jail, which corresponds to the suicide attempt we mentioned. The kind of most significant one is the tragedy that happened. He explains it as the most intense major vision. It went on for approximately 2 days. And obviously I can explain that when you'd like me to.
It ties into my next question. Did Matthew speak to you about his state of mind, his mental health on the days leading up to this tragedy?
He did.
If you can please go over that to the court.
So again, I want to be clear. It doesn't matter for the law's purposes in New Jersey. In other words, you can have a temporary condition, you can have an episodic condition. But for the purposes of my consistency in line with all the data, I want to remind that he was chronically, consistently psychotic 100% of the time for years to that point. So it's hard to differentiate, again, a change in his presentation, if you will. But there was a change, actually, even for as sick as he had been. And I know you asked me about him, but if I might take liberty, even his family indicated like he was more agitated leading up to that. And as I said, his brother, who I didn't speak with, but who spoke with law enforcement, indicated, again, just a difference. In other words, his visions and these symptoms, everyone was certainly trying to help him with, and it's not like everyone was like, okay, that's no big deal, but that had been going on for some time. But there was starting to be a noticeable change leading up to what happens, spending more time in bed and more irritable and all these things. He explains in great depth, frankly, which I'm sure you don't want me to go through necessarily here, but he explains a very detailed major vision or episode that involves Christ. It involves a lot of, I'm going to call it symbolism. He's not necessarily calling it symbolism, but 7 trumpets and 7 bowls of plagues poured out, and it's just all very apocalyptic, and his souls become involved, and what have you. And so that's kind of happening. effectively, as I indicated in my report, I believe, he essentially experiences the book of Revelation, but like he literally experiences it, and he describes that in significant depth. And it also involves, as I noted before, the themes of his souls and other things he had already been struggling with.
And what time frame is this in relation to the tragedy?
Well, at that point, it's leading directly into what happens. And again, unfortunately, it becomes the cause of what happens.
You had mentioned several times a book he was reading called The Red Book.
Yes, it's Carl Jung's book.
And why is that significant in your...
Matthew was reading a lot of books. 3 books become particularly important to him. One is Carl Jung's Red Book. Carl Jung was a psychiatrist, Swiss psychiatrist from the early first half of the 20th century, and it wasn't really, frankly, a book. It wasn't kind of like an educational book. It was a series of writings that weren't even necessarily supposed to be published, but they were very extreme and symbolic, and talked about murder and sacrifice and a lot of things. In other words, it wasn't a psychologist kind of get help type of scenario. He was a certain type of psychiatrist who pushed the limits of consciousness, and it was almost more philosophical in nature. That becomes very relevant. Nietzsche, he's reading Nietzsche. Nietzsche was relevant as well, and then the Bible, and again, Revelation comes in. The overarching point here is that he's trying to figure out meaning for himself, for his souls, for his identity, for all these philosophical themes. But the Carl Jung book and the aspects of it become directly relevant to his actions at the time of this tragedy.
Was there a particular chapter, sacrificial murder, in that book that had some significance in your evaluation?
Yes, so ultimately, he had read that book and he had read that chapter and others many times prior to this date. But for him, because remember, he was dealing with severe psychosis at that point, it kind of clicks for him in terms of meaning. In other words, all these statements that are being made and concepts and what have you. So he puts 2 and 2 together, so to speak. But again, I want to remind that as we look at it, it's not really possible to make sense of something that's psychotic, other than to say professionally, how is he looking at it? So he starts to look at it in the context of this major vision, in the context of this constant fight that he thought he was having. He was witnessing Jesus be resurrected and crucified and over and over and over. Again, that was also corroborated by family or his brother to police that was reported that day. He was going through it. So I want to point out, that's also another example, as I said before. Matthew has this ability, which I haven't seen really before, frankly, very much, to still function. In other words, to seemingly function. Like, he was talking to his brother, he went to grocery shopping, but his internal state was completely psychotic. And so anyhow, he puts 2 and 2 together about some of the symbolism in that book, the Carl Jung's Red Book, and what it meant. And ultimately, unfortunately, he took a couple of the symbolic language that was used and examples that were used literally in his psychosis, and he attributed them to his brother Joseph and also the cat, and that unfortunately led him to act.
And prior to the incident in question, was he taking antipsychotic medication?
No. It had been at least 4 or 5 months from everything I've seen, that he had taken it. And it's not to excuse him from not taking it, but I do want to just remind that he had, I have no indication from any of the records I saw that any of the medication had ever reduced his symptoms. I'm not saying they won't now or moving forward. I'm just saying, I'm just pointing that out.
And do you know if he's taking any antipsychotic medication now?
I don't know as of now, as of today meeting. I haven't seen him since September. I presume he is, but when I saw him, he was.
And at one point in time, did you ever ask Matthew why he attempted suicide when he was in jail?
So again, that was more connected to, it was also connected to another major vision he had, relatively less severe than the one during the incident involving his brother, but similar content. He thought maybe he was the Christ or the Antichrist, and he needed to maybe end his life to prevent an apocalypse. So what's happening, as you're seeing, is Matthew, at the time of the incident and then subsequent even to himself, he's trying to figure out, just as he had been for years, how to stop what's happening, essentially. And unfortunately, it had been happening for a long time to him, these types of visions and symptoms and concerns and anxieties and you name it. But ultimately, after that kind of spiritual journey he took in 2023, and things were still not necessarily changing, but he thought he was gaining clarity, ultimately he did act on it with his brother, and then he also acted to harm himself after that as a result.
As part of your review of this file, you did interview Matthew's parents.
I did.
And can you just summarize what you learned, if anything, relative to your ultimate conclusion?
I interviewed them at significant length as well, 10 hours over 3 phone sessions. And again, at the sake of being redundant, I'll just say, or excuse me, at the risk of being redundant, I won't go through everything, but I'll say that it was just all corroborated in terms of his extensive mental health history, in terms of the symptoms he had been experiencing for a number of years. Also, that prior he did very well, as a young person, and was very active and never violent or anything along those lines. And everything in terms of the records and everything I've reviewed today with everybody here was corroborated. They also indicated that essentially all of his reports to me were consistent with what they knew, although they didn't necessarily know all the details of what he was thinking that day or what have you, but ultimately everything was consistent. And frankly, every data source that I've looked at and every aspect of data has been consistent, pointing in the same direction. Of course, some have more or less details, but there's no data that I've seen that contradicts or points in any other direction, which is why I can have such a strong opinion.
Did they tell you he never appeared violent before this?
Correct. There's no indication from any source that he was ever violent or threat. Well, slight caveat. There was some irritability. He had been taking a lot of Adderall at one point, as they indicated, and I think maybe he threw like a pill bottle at a window or something. These types of things, but nothing with any pattern or consistency or major concern. They indicated that there was a concern about the suicidality at that prior point, which we have already covered at a prior admission. But again, that was also brief. And as I learned from spending so much time with him, it's all been this ongoing attempts for him to try to figure out what's happening to him and how to fix it.
Did they talk about his educational background?
Yes, he has a strong educational background. He was a student athlete. He was an extremely good student, top student, academically. There were never any significant concerns.
He played sports in college?
Yes, soccer.
Anything else from the interviews of his parents that you feel is important to the ultimate conclusion you make here this morning?
One moment, please. No, I don't think so. I think that I think I can just say that everything they reported to me was consistent with the other data sources as well.
Okay. Dr. Pirelli, as a result of your review of the discovery in this case, the treatment records of Matthew Hertgen, the collateral interviews you conducted with family members, and the evaluation of Matthew himself, were you able to form an opinion as to whether Matthew Hertgen was criminally responsible for his conduct on February 22nd, 2025, pursuant to NJSA 2C:4-1?
Yes.
And what is that opinion?
So I always want to say, Your Honor, of course, it's your decision. It's a legal decision. It's not mine. But as an expert, I would strongly recommend, based on my extensive expertise, that he does meet the statute. He did not have the ability to comprehend the wrongfulness of his actions at the time of this incident. That is my opinion within a reasonable degree of psychological certainty, and that is also my opinion that applies to all charges in this matter. That's not always the case. Of course, sometimes there are charges in a case that correspond to different time periods or over the course of a year or something, but it is my strong opinion that he would meet the insanity defense. And as I say, Your Honor, frankly, this is probably essentially the strongest case that I would see and that I have seen.
Did Matthew Hertgen suffer from a mental disease and defect of reason that precluded his ability to truly comprehend the wrongfulness of his actions during the February 2025 incident?
Yes, the schizophrenia is my strong opinion about his diagnosis, and it was absolutely active and severe at that time.
And so you did arrive at a diagnosis for Matthew after reviewing this entire file?
Yes, in addition to, he did have some history of substance use, but again, he had been sober for a long time. His primary diagnosis is schizophrenia.
Now, do you have any recommendations for Matthew's mental health treatment going forward?
Yes. That's not necessarily a primary question for me, but of course, as a licensed professional, I always want to include it especially when I feel strongly about it. Certainly, he needs to continue to take psychiatric medication and work with his providers. I'm hopeful that he can continue to work with them to find something that might be better for him. Potentially, over time, if I don't know what he's doing right at this moment, but if there's injectable options, what have you, that can help also. Either way, there's going to have to be a fair amount of trial and error because he's been what's referred to as treatment refractory, meaning the medication has not been helpful in years. So it's going to take a lot of work for him to work on that. I also certainly recommended that he continue in a secure inpatient environment. I strongly recommend that he remain in Ann Klein for the foreseeable future. Obviously, if Your Honor agrees with my opinion, there would be subsequent hearings that would deal with, his risk and treatment moving forward. But other than that, I also indicated, kind of probably the obvious: no drugs, no alcohol, no weapons. The kind of standard ones. I also indicated, of course, I make no imposition on the family, but if they would like to be in his life in any way, I strongly recommend that Matthew should be required to sign releases for them to be able to communicate with providers. I mean, he's an adult, so they wouldn't otherwise be able to do that. He's not incapacitated per se. So again, I don't in any way have any opinion as to what the family should do. All I say is if the family chooses to be in his life, I strongly believe he should be compelled to sign those releases.
Thank you. Now, you're aware the report that you prepared was turned over to the state, and the state then sought their own expert to review this file. You aware of that?
Yes, I have been.
And that report was from Dr. Schneidman?
Dr. Schneidman, I believe.
Schneidman?
Yes.
Are you familiar with her?
Not personally, but I'm familiar professionally of her name and her work somewhat.
Did you get a chance to review her report?
Yes.
Do you have any comments on her report?
Sure. She wrote a very strong report. I think what's most important to point out, perhaps for our purposes here, is that we are in complete agreement. Obviously, I don't want to speak for her, but I can say that I don't see any disagreement in her report. She completely, I don't want to say she completely agreed. She came up with her own independent opinion, of course, but she completely supported also the insanity defense. In this case, she also diagnosed him with schizophrenia. And she also, in her articulation of her conclusions, in the same way I've described, talked about his inability to comprehend the wrongfulness of what he was doing. And I guess the last point I would make is, in addition to all of that, the main points, the major points, even the details were completely consistent. I did not see anything in Dr. Schneidman's report in terms of any data that she gathered. We looked at the same sources, but I mean in terms of her interviewing with Matthew, for instance, that was in any way, shape, or form different or inconsistent with mine. So again, even though that's not, her report is obviously not part of my opinions for my report, as I sit here today, I can say, well, that makes me obviously extremely confident, even though I had already been, in my opinion, because now we have effectively 10 different entities or separate professionals who have all basically seen the same thing, said the same thing. And then in terms of this specific question at hand, the legal question, you have two experts, one for the defense, one for prosecution, who are in complete agreement, from what I can tell, complete agreement.
And you're aware that she had the opportunity to interview Matthew?
She did.
From your review of her
She
report
did.
and review his records as well?
Yes.
And just so the record's clear, she was an expert, a doctor that was hired by the state to review essentially this file as well, to get an independent evaluation.
Yes.
And it was the same conclusion.
Yes.
Doctor, you issued all of your professional opinions here this morning and all others in your report within a reasonable degree of psychological certainty?
Yes, sir.
That's all I have, Judge. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kennedy, Cross. Judge Barrett, briefly.
Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning, sir.
Just very briefly, Doctor, I just want to reiterate for the record, it's your opinion that the defendant's schizophrenia, his delusions, his hallucinations, that's what caused him to act and commit the crimes in this case, correct?
Yes, sir.
And it's your opinion that those delusions, those hallucinations that really prevented him from understanding the nature of his conduct and really what he was doing was right or wrong, correct?
Yes.
And again, you indicated that the state's expert, Dr. Schneidman, reached the same conclusion as you, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Judge. I have no further questions.
Any redirect?
I have no question.
Okay, thank you very much. Doctor, thank you very much. You can step in.
Do you need me to stay Your Honor, in the building?
That's totally up to you.
Yes? Okay, I will, if you want. That's
Whatever, Mr.
Thank you, sir.